thank you all for coming, and a special thanks to Doug for inviting me. I'm really honored to be here. Doug asked me to do something that would be a little bit of an academic lecture and a little bit of a political speech. I should confess at the start that I like political speeches more, so I may lean a little bit in that direction. So the first thing I wanted to do was talk a little bit about why we need to talk about values. One of the things I do as a candidate is I meet many MPs coming from other parts of the country, and I often have this conversation with them about what the Liberal Party message needs to be. And of course, some people think that all we need to do is talk about policies, and if we just get out there and have the best policies, we'll win. And I think one of the lessons I draw from last year's election is that the best policies don't necessarily win an election for you. And certainly one of the experiences I had at the doors in Edmonton-Sherwood Park was I would be talking to people, especially about one of the elements of the last year's platform, the idea of giving a working income tax credit, giving a tax credit to low-income people to encourage people to get off social assistance and go get jobs. And people really liked that idea. It seemed like a really sensible idea. But I had several people tell me, that sounds like a good idea, but I can't believe Liberals would do that. And that's the sort of thing we face here in Alberta, is we can have the best policies in the world, but if people don't trust, if they're viewing us in a certain way, if they think Liberals are about a certain thing, then they will think we have the wrong goals and the wrong means to get them, and so policies on their own won't get us there. On the other hand, of course, if they're starting out with this wrong vision of what we stand for, and all we talk about is values, then that won't work either. So what I would urge you, as you go into your workshops later this afternoon, is to do the two. But I think what we need is a message that talks about our values and then ties those values into particular policies. But either one of them won't work for us, that we need the two of them together. So having hopefully set the stage that we're willing to talk about values here, talk about policies a fair bit too, the second thing that Doug asked me to do is talk a little bit about the different sorts of ethical perspectives of different political parties. As it happens, I wrote an article a few years ago talking about the ethical backgrounds of different parties. Philosophers tend to talk about three ways that people make ethical decisions. The most common way, I think, is to just decide that something is good if it has good consequences. And that tends to be the point of view that Liberals take. So we'll choose a policy if we think it's going to lead to good outcomes. And so we're kind of lucky in that way. Liberals, I think, are naturally consequentialist in outlook, and that tends to be the sort of way that most people go about making most of their ethical decisions. So we start in a good position. But of course, consequentialism isn't the only way to make ethical decisions. And even consequentialists, of course, you have to worry about what consequences they want. Again, if people out there have a view that the Liberal Party wants different consequences from them, then when we talk about our policies, they're suspicious of both our goals and our strategies. The second way that philosophers talk about is to have certain values or virtues that one relies on. And of course, most of us do a bit of that too. Indeed, all of us in our lives mix these different ethical strategies. And so, even if you're a consequentialist, you may well find times in your life when you think, well, if I lied a little bit here, that would have good consequences, but I'm an honest person, and so I really feel compelled to tell the truth. Okay, so that's virtue analysis. You've decided you want to be an honest person or a courageous person or a caring person, and then you judge things in terms of whether they're honest or courageous or caring. One of the messages that I think we all need to understand, successful politicians don't just speak to people that think the same way they do, they speak to people that think in other ways. So if I'm right, the natural tendency of Liberals is to be consequentialist, and that encourages us to just talk about our policies and how wonderful they'll be. We also need to frame that message so it appeals to people who think in terms of virtue and talk about how the society that we're trying to create with our wonderful policies is a caring society and an honest society, and so on. The other way that philosophers tend to stress is what's called is kind of a rule-based sort of ethical analysis. So we all were taught the golden rule as kids, and we all tend to kind of think things like, well, I won't do that because I wouldn't want someone to do it to me. The rules that tend to get referred to the most in modern society are rights. And an awful lot of people argue from rights. And of course, there are many liberals who are primarily rights-oriented. So again, what we need to do while we're talking about our policies is not only talk about the values that our policies reflect, but the sorts of rights that they help to uphold and so on. Okay, in the political spectrum that we have before us in Canada today, I should first mention there are two other ways. Philosophers don't tend to stress it, but there's two other ways we make ethical decisions. One of those is to rely on our intuition. And indeed, although we don't often like to admit it in academia, if it wasn't for the fact that behaving badly made us feel bad, and behaving nicely made us feel good, none of us would have any reason for being ethical. So we should never neglect the fact that there's an important base of ethics in intuition. And then, of course, the final way is tradition, that we often decide that things are good or ethical simply because that's what our society has always done. Now, if you look at our present political spectrum, real conservatives, the conservative philosophy is supposed to be grounded in tradition. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, I think all Canadians, or at least 95% of us, should stop once a day and kick ourselves about how lucky we are to live in this country. So we shouldn't have a problem with that aspect of the conservative perspective. We respect tradition too. We're pragmatic people. We change things slowly because we know we've inherited a really good world, and we want to just make it a little bit better for the next generation. So there's nothing wrong with us pursuing our policies and at the same time appealing to people who speak from tradition in the Conservative Party. We as Liberals, as I said, are consequentialist. There's a tendency for people in the New Democrat Party to focus, to be values-oriented. And of course, the danger of being values-oriented is precisely that you may pursue values to an extreme. Aristotle warned us about that thousands of years ago, that it's easy to be too courageous, too honest, that every virtue can be taken too far. And of course, the danger out there is that if one has just decided, I really want to be a caring person, the danger is that you then latch onto policies that make you feel good, but might not actually help anybody. So there's the beauty of tying values to a consequential sort of analysis is that we move beyond just feeling good about our policies, but being convinced that our policies will actually help the people that we want to help. In terms of a rule-based approach, of course, it depends, especially when you look at rights analysis, it depends on which rights you think are the most important. So if you're kind of looking at the more modern rights, things like gay rights and so on, you tend to be a liberal these days. If the right that you care about is the right of people to hold on to all their money and not have any of it taxed away, then you're more likely to be a conservative. So again, so the point here of this section is just to remember that there's different ways that people go about doing ethical analysis, that different parties tend to have different priorities in the way they do ethical analysis, that we as liberals have an advantage because consequential analysis tends to be the way most people think, but that we can broaden our appeal that while we're talking about how wonderful our policies are, we connect them to values that Canadians share, concerns about rights that are shared widely, and that we shouldn't be shy about appealing to tradition, because this really is a pretty wonderful country we live in, and we should never stop saying that, and we shouldn't be shy about making emotional appeals. Because again, people don't just vote on the basis of reason, they vote on the basis of what feels good. And so that sort of emotional talk does actually have a role in political discourse. Okay, so that's the second part, to just remind us that there's different ways of doing ethical analysis, different parties have different preferences, and if we want to expand our appeal, we need to appeal to people who think in a different way.